The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street as 73-year-old Frank Morrison slowly made his way down the sidewalk. His weathered hands gripped his walking cane tighter than usual, not because of his aging knees, but because of what awaited him at the corner store. For the past 3 weeks, the same group of teenagers had been making his daily walk to buy groceries a living nightmare. Frank had served 2 tours in Vietnam, survived the Tet Offensive, and carried shrapnel in his left leg for over 50 years. He had faced down enemy fire and watched good men die beside him. But somehow these kids with their sneering faces and cruel words made him feel smaller than he had in decades. As he approached Murphy's corner store, he could see them already gathered outside. 5 teenagers, probably around 16 or 17, dressed in expensive sneakers and designer hoodies that cost more than Frank's monthly pension check. They were laughing about something on one of their phones, but Frank knew that laughter would soon turn to mockery directed at him. The leader of the group was a tall, lanky kid named Derek Chun. His parents owned the biggest real estate company in town, and Derek wore his privilege like armor. His dark hair was styled perfectly, and his clothes were always immaculate. But there was something cold in his eyes, something that reminded Frank of the bullies he had known in his own youth. Except these kids had never faced any real hardship or consequence for their actions. Well, look who's hobbling down the street again, Derek called out as Frank approached the store entrance. The other kids immediately perked up, sensing entertainment was about to begin. Hey, old man, did you forget to take your pills again? You're walking even slower than yesterday. Frank kept his eyes forward and tried to walk past them, but Derek stepped directly into his path. The elderly veteran looked up at the teenager, his gray eyes meeting Derek's challenging stare. Frank had learned long ago that bullies fed on fear and reaction, so he tried to remain calm. "Excuse me, son," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years and experience. "I just need to buy some groceries." Derek's friends erupted in laughter. "Did you hear that? He called Derek's son," shouted a red-haired boy named Tommy. "That's hilarious. Derek, I think your grandpa wants to adopt you." "Listen, Gramps," Derek said, his voice dripping with disrespect, "maybe you should just order your food online like normal people. This whole shuffling around town thing is getting pathetic. You're making everyone uncomfortable." Frank felt his jaw tighten, but he maintained his composure. "I've been shopping at this store for 15 years, long before you kids were even born. I have every right to be here." "Rights?" Derek scoffed. "You think you have rights? Look at you. You can barely stand up straight. What did you ever do that was so important anyway? Let me guess, you probably just sat behind a desk somewhere filing papers." The comment hit Frank like a physical blow. He thought about his medals gathering dust in a drawer at home, about his Purple Heart, about the Bronze Star he had never felt comfortable displaying. He thought about the friends who never made it home, about the young soldiers who had looked up to him as their sergeant, about the lives he had saved, and the nights he still woke up in cold sweats remembering the war. But he said none of this. Instead, Frank simply tried to step around Derek again, only to have the teenager deliberately bump into him, nearly causing the elderly man to lose his balance. "Whoa there, old-timer," Derek said with fake concern. "You need to be more careful. At your age, a fall could really hurt." The cruelty in his voice was unmistakable. Frank steadied himself with his cane and looked directly at Derek. "Young man, I don't know what I've done to earn your disrespect, but I'm asking you politely to leave me alone." "Oh, now he's asking politely," Derek mimicked in a high-pitched, mocking tone. Please leave me alone. I'm just a helpless old man who can't take care of himself." The other teenagers were recording everything on their phones now, and Frank could see that this had become some sort of sick entertainment for them. He realized that his words were only making things worse, but he couldn't bring himself to simply turn around and go home. He needed those groceries, and more importantly, he refused to be driven away from a place where he had shopped peacefully for years. "You know what your problem is, old man?" Derek continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "You're from a different time, a time that doesn't matter anymore. The world has moved on without you, and you're too stupid to realize it. You should just go home and wait to die like all the other useless old people." Frank felt his heart rate increase, not from fear, but from a deep, burning anger that he hadn't felt in years. He thought about all the young men he had served with, kids Derek's age who had shown more courage and honor in a single day than this bully would show in his entire life. He thought about his daughter Sarah, who was currently deployed overseas, serving her country just as he had done decades before. "Listen here, son," Frank said, his voice still calm, but with an edge of steel that hadn't been there before. "I've seen real toughness, and I've known real men. You're neither." Derek's face flushed red with anger. "What did you just say to me?" "You heard me," Frank replied, standing a little straighter despite the pain in his leg. "You think picking on an old man makes you tough? You think having your little friends record you being cruel makes you important? I've known boys your age who showed more character in a single moment than you've shown in your entire life." The group of teenagers fell silent for a moment, clearly not expecting Frank to fight back verbally. Derek looked around at his friends, realizing that his authority was being challenged in front of them. His face grew darker, and Frank could see the dangerous shift in the young man's demeanor. "Shut up, old man," Derek shouted, his voice echoing off the nearby buildings. "You don't know anything about me or my friends. You're just a bitter, pathetic old fool who can't accept that nobody cares about you anymore." Frank felt the words like physical blows, but he refused to show how much they hurt. He had endured worse than teenage insults. He had survived war, loss, and decades of struggle. But standing there, facing down this group of privileged kids who had never known hardship, he felt more alone than he had in years. "I may be old," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness, "but at least I know the difference between strength and cruelty. At least I know what it means to stand up for something bigger than myself." Derek stepped closer to Frank, close enough that the elderly man could smell the expensive cologne the teenager wore. "You want to talk about standing up for something? You're standing up for nothing, old man. You're standing up for being a loser who has to shop for groceries by himself because nobody in his family even cares enough to help him." The comment about family hit Frank harder than Derek could have known. Frank's wife had passed away 3 years ago, and his daughter Sarah was deployed with the Navy, stationed thousands of miles away. His son lived across the country and called maybe once a month. The loneliness that Derek had identified and attacked was real, and it cut deep. Frank's hands trembled slightly on his cane, not from age, but from the effort it took to control his emotions. He thought about walking away, about giving up, and going home to his empty house. But then he thought about Sarah, about the pride in her voice when she called him on Sundays, about the way she had hugged him before her last deployment, and told him she was proud to be his daughter. "My family," Frank said slowly, "may not be here with me today, but they love me. And, more importantly, they know what honor means. They know what it means to serve something greater than themselves." Derek laughed harshly. "Honor? Service? You sound like one of those old military guys who thinks the world owes them something. Let me break it to you, Gramps. Nobody cares about whatever you did 40 years ago. This is the real world now. And in the real world, you're just an old man taking up space." Frank looked at Derek for a long moment, seeing not just a cruel teenager, but a young person who had clearly never been taught respect, never been challenged, never been held accountable for his actions. He felt a moment of sadness for the boy, wondering what had shaped him into someone capable of such casual cruelty. "You're wrong about one thing, son," Frank said finally. "It wasn't 40 years ago. I may be old, but the values I learned in service, respect, honor, courage, those aren't outdated. They're timeless. And someday, when life gets hard for you, you'll understand why they matter." Derek's response was swift and vicious. "The only thing that's gonna get hard is watching you try to make it up these stairs without falling down, you pathetic old fool. Why don't you just go home and leave this place to people who actually belong here?" As Derek spoke, he gestured dismissively with his hand, the motion causing him to accidentally knock Frank's cane from his grip. The walking stick clattered to the ground, and Frank had to grab onto the store's railing to keep from falling. For a moment, something flickered in Derek's eyes that might have been regret or embarrassment, but it was quickly replaced by defiance. Instead of apologizing or helping Frank retrieve his cane, Derek looked at his friends and forced a laugh. "Oops," Derek said with exaggerated sarcasm. "Looks like Grandpa dropped his stick. Maybe you should get one of those motorized scooters instead." Frank carefully bent down to retrieve his cane, his pride stinging more than his back. As he straightened up, he looked at each of the teenagers, memorizing their faces, noting the mixture of discomfort and cruel amusement in their expressions. Most of them looked away when he met their eyes, but Derek stared back defiantly. "You boys have a good day," Frank said quietly, his dignity intact despite everything that had happened. I hope someday you learn that strength isn't about hurting people who can't fight back. As Frank made his way into the store, he could hear Derek's voice behind him, louder than before, clearly meant for him to hear. Yeah, run away, old man. Come back tomorrow, so we can remind you again that nobody wants you here. Inside the store, Frank moved slowly through the aisles, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up the items on his list. The store owner, Mrs. Murphy, watched him with concern from behind the counter. She had seen the confrontation through the window, but hadn't known what to do about it. "You okay, Frank?" she asked as he approached the checkout counter. Frank managed a small smile. "I'm fine, Margaret. Just some kids being kids." But Margaret had seen enough to know that this wasn't just typical teenage behavior. She had watched Derek and his friends harass several elderly customers over the past few weeks, and she was getting tired of it. As she rang up Frank's groceries, she made a mental note to call the police if the harassment continued. Frank paid for his groceries and made his way back outside, dreading the confrontation that he knew awaited him. Sure enough, Derek and his friends were still there, their attention immediately focusing on him as he emerged from the store. "Back so soon," Derek called out. "What's wrong? Couldn't find the denture cream you were looking for?" Frank tried to ignore them and head toward home, but Derek stepped into his path again, this time more aggressively than before. "I'm talking to you, old man," Derek said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Don't you think it's rude to ignore someone when they're talking to you?" Frank stopped and looked up at Derek, seeing something new in the teenager's eyes, something dangerous. The game had escalated beyond simple mockery, and Frank realized that Derek was looking for a reaction, any excuse to take things further. "I heard you loud and clear, son," Frank said carefully. "I just don't see any point in continuing this conversation." "So," Derek's voice rose sharply. "I told you not to call me that. You're not my father. You're not my grandfather. You're nothing to me. You're just some old loser who thinks the world owes him respect because he's old." Frank could see that Derek was working himself up, feeding off the attention of his friends and the power he felt in tormenting someone he perceived as helpless. The other teenagers were getting caught up in their leader's energy, and Frank sensed that the situation was about to spiral out of control. "Derek," Frank said, using the boy's name deliberately, hoping to personalize the interaction and maybe break through the cruel persona. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to go home." The use of his name seemed to surprise Derek for a moment, but then his expression hardened even more. "How do you know my name? Have you been asking about me? That's creepy, old man. Are you some kind of stalker?" Frank realized his mistake too late. He had heard other people in the neighborhood mention Derek's name, had heard store owners complaining about the boy's behavior, but Derek didn't know that. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, Frank explained patiently. "I know most of the families around here. I remember when you were just a little kid riding your bicycle down this street." This revelation seemed to infuriate Derek even more. "You've been watching me since I was a kid? That's sick. You're some kind of creepy old pervert who spies on children." "That's not what I meant," Frank said quickly, realizing that Derek was deliberately twisting his words. "I just meant that I've been a part of this community for a long time." But Derek wasn't interested in explanations. He turned to his friends with a look of disgust. "Did you guys hear this? This creepy old man has been watching me since I was little. He probably has pictures of all the kids in the neighborhood." The accusation was so ridiculous and unfair that Frank felt his carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack. He had spent his entire life serving others, protecting others, and now he was being painted as some kind of predator by a teenager who didn't know the first thing about him. "That's enough," Frank said, his voice firmer than it had been all morning. "You can insult me all you want, but I won't stand here and let you make disgusting accusations that aren't true." Derek smiled coldly, recognizing that he had finally gotten under Frank's skin. "Oh, now you're getting tough? What are you going to do about it, old man? You can barely walk, let alone fight." Frank felt decades of military training and discipline warring with a growing anger that he hadn't felt since his combat days. Every instinct told him to de-escalate, to walk away, to be the bigger person. But another part of him, a part that had been forged in the jungles of Vietnam, was tired of taking abuse from someone who had never faced real adversity. "I don't want to fight you, son," Frank said quietly, but there was something in his voice that made Derek take a small step back. "But I won't be disrespected, and I won't be accused of things I haven't done." Derek quickly recovered his bravado, especially with his friends watching. "You don't want to fight me? Good, because you'd lose. You'd probably break a hip just trying to throw a punch. The mockery continued, but Frank had stopped listening. He was thinking about his daughter Sarah, wondering what she would think if she could see him now. Would she be proud of how he was handling this situation, or disappointed that he was allowing himself to be bullied by children? As if summoned by his thoughts, Frank's phone buzzed in his pocket. He normally would never answer a call during a confrontation like this, but something made him pull out the device and look at the screen. It was Sarah calling from overseas. Frank looked at Derek and his friends, then at his phone, then made a decision that would change everything. Frank answered the phone with a simple, "Hello, sweetheart," his voice immediately softening despite the tension surrounding him. Derek and his friends continued their taunting, but Frank focused entirely on his daughter's voice coming through the speaker. "Dad, I'm so glad I caught you." Sarah's voice was clear and strong, carrying across thousands of miles from her naval base. "I only have a few minutes, but I wanted to hear your voice. How are you doing?" Frank walked a few steps away from Derek's group, but they followed him, clearly enjoying the idea of disrupting his phone call. Derek made exaggerated whisper sounds, and his friends snickered, trying to make it impossible for Frank to have a normal conversation. "I'm doing fine, honey," Frank lied, not wanting to worry his daughter with his problems. "Just out doing some shopping. How are things over there?" Sarah's voice took on an excited tone. "Actually, Dad, I have some incredible news. I just got word that my unit is being rotated home early. We'll be stateside in 3 weeks. I can't wait to see you." The news hit Frank like a wave of pure joy, temporarily washing away the stress of the confrontation. His daughter was coming home early and safely. For a moment, he forgot entirely about Derek and his friends. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "I miss you so much. The house hasn't been the same without your visits." Derek, frustrated by being ignored, raised his voice louder. "Hey, old man, it's rude to take phone calls when people are talking to you." Frank turned away from the teenagers, trying to shield the conversation, but Derek deliberately stepped closer, clearly intending to disrupt the call. "Who are you talking to anyway?" Derek called out in a voice loud enough for Sarah to hear through the phone. "Your imaginary girlfriend?" Sarah's voice immediately sharpened. "Dad, is someone there with you? Is everything okay?" Frank hesitated, not wanting to lie to his daughter, but also not wanting to involve her in his problems when she was so far away and dealing with her own challenges. But Derek made the decision for him by speaking directly toward the phone. "Yeah, we're here with your dad." Derek called out cheerfully, as if he were Frank's friend. We're just having a nice conversation with him about how he should probably stay home instead of bothering people. The line went silent for a moment, and Frank could practically feel his daughter's protective instincts kicking in from thousands of miles away. "Dad," Sarah's voice was calm, but carried an undertone that Frank recognized from her childhood. The tone she used when someone had crossed the line. "Are you being bothered by someone?" Frank looked at Derek, who was grinning widely, clearly proud of himself for disrupting the call. The other teenagers were laughing and recording, treating the whole situation like entertainment. "It's nothing serious, honey," Frank said quietly. "Just some local kids acting up. Don't worry about it." But Sarah was already in full protective daughter mode. "Put me on speaker, Dad." "Sarah, that's not necessary. Dad, put me on speaker. Now." Frank knew that tone. His daughter had inherited her stubborn streak directly from him, and when she made up her mind about something, there was no talking her out of it. With a sigh, he activated the speakerphone function. "Can you hear me now?" Sarah's voice came through clearly, carrying an authority that made all the teenagers stop laughing. Derek, still feeling bold and not understanding what he was dealing with, leaned toward the phone. "Yeah, we can hear you. You're his daughter, right? You should really talk to your dad about staying home. He's kind of a public nuisance." The silence that followed was so profound that even Derek seemed to sense he had made a mistake. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was perfectly controlled, but Frank recognized the danger in it. "What's your name, kid?" Derek, still not grasping the shift in dynamics, puffed out his chest. "I'm Derek Shun. Not that it's any of your business. And who are you to tell me what to do?" "Derek Shun," Sarah repeated slowly, as if memorizing it. "And you think my father is a public nuisance?" "Yeah, actually I do," Derek said, emboldened by what he perceived as a safe distance between himself and this disembodied voice. "He shuffles around here every day, getting in people's way, making everyone uncomfortable. Maybe you should put him in a home or something." Frank closed his eyes, knowing that Derek had just said exactly the wrong thing to exactly the wrong person. Sarah had been protective of her father since childhood, and the military had only sharpened those instincts. "I see," Sarah said, her voice getting quieter in a way that made Frank nervous. "And how old are you, Derek?" "Old enough to know that your dad doesn't belong here?" Derek shot back, not recognizing the trap he was walking into. "That's interesting," Sarah continued, her tone still conversational. "Because my father, Frank Morrison, served 2 tours in Vietnam. He earned a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a Combat Infantry Badge. He spent 2 years in hell, so that kids like you could have the freedom to act like spoiled brats in suburban parking lots." Derek's smirk faltered slightly, but he wasn't ready to back down. "So what? That was like 50 years ago. What's he done lately?" Frank winced, knowing his daughter well enough to recognize that Derek had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. "What has he done lately?" Sarah's voice was now carrying the crisp authority of a naval officer. "He raised a daughter who became a Navy SEAL, Derek. And that daughter is very interested in your opinion about where her father belongs." The color drained from Derek's face. Even his friends stopped recording and started looking uncomfortable. The phrase Navy SEAL had a way of cutting through teenage bravado like a knife. "Navy SEAL." Derek's voice cracked slightly on the words. "That's right," Sarah continued, her voice now carrying the full weight of her training and authority. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, United States Navy SEALs, currently deployed with SEAL Team 3. And, Derek, I want you to think very carefully about your next words." Frank watched as the entire dynamic shifted in real time. Derek went from confident bully to uncertain teenager in the span of seconds. His friends were backing away slightly, clearly recognizing that they had stumbled into something much bigger than they had anticipated. I didn't know," Derek stammered. "No, you didn't know," Sarah agreed. "You didn't know that you were harassing a decorated combat veteran. You didn't know that you were disrespecting a man who has sacrificed more for this country than you'll ever understand. And you didn't know that his daughter is trained in about 50 different ways to make you regret your life choices." Derek was now looking frantically at his friends for support, but they were all staring at the ground or backing away. The power dynamic had completely reversed, and suddenly, Derek was the one feeling small and alone. "But here's what I want you to understand, Derek," Sarah continued, her voice taking on an almost educational tone. "My father has spent his entire life serving others. He spent 2 years in combat, 25 years raising a family, and 15 years being a good neighbor in your community. He has earned respect through his actions, his sacrifice, and his character." Frank felt a swell of pride listening to his daughter defend him, but also a growing concern about where this was heading. "Sarah, honey, it's okay," he said softly. "No, Dad, it's not okay," Sarah replied firmly. "Because Derek here seems to think that respect is something you take instead of something you earn. Isn't that right, Derek?" Derek opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was clearly out of his depth and beginning to realize the gravity of his situation. "Let me paint a picture for you, Derek," Sarah continued. "In about 3 weeks, I'm coming home from deployment. I'll be in town for several months while my unit retrains. During that time, I'll be checking on my father regularly. And if I hear that you or your friends have so much as looked at him wrong, you and are going to have a very different kind of conversation. Are we clear?" Derek nodded frantically, even though Sarah couldn't see him through the phone. "I need to hear you say it, Derek." "Yes," Derek croaked out. "We're clear." "Good," Sarah said, her voice softening slightly but still maintaining its authority. "Now, I want you to apologize to my father for your disrespectful behavior." Derek looked at Frank, his earlier arrogance completely gone. I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison. I didn't know about your service or anything. I'm really sorry." Frank looked at the teenager, seeing not the bully who had tormented him minutes earlier, but a scared kid who had just learned a hard lesson about consequences. Despite everything Derek had put him through, Frank felt a moment of sympathy for him. "Apology accepted, Derek," Frank said quietly. "But I hope you'll remember this lesson the next time you're tempted to pick on someone." Sarah's voice came through the phone again, still addressing Derek. "Derek, I want you to understand something. My father is a good man who has earned his place in this community through decades of service and sacrifice. He doesn't need to justify his existence to anyone, especially not to someone who has never contributed anything meaningful to society." Derek nodded again, his face red with embarrassment and shame. But here's the thing, Sarah continued. I believe in second chances. I believe that people can learn from their mistakes and become better. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to prove that you're better than the person you show my father today. Frank wasn't sure where his daughter was going with this, but he trusted her judgment. Every week for the next month, Sarah said, I want you to do something to help an elderly person in your community. It doesn't have to be big or dramatic. Help someone carry groceries, shovel a walkway, offer to run an errand. I want you to learn that elderly people aren't burdens or nuisances. They're treasures with decades of wisdom and experience. Derek looked confused, but nodded eagerly, clearly relieved that Sarah wasn't threatening more serious consequences. And Derek, Sarah's voice carried a final note of warning. I'll be checking on this. The military has a very long reach, and I have friends in many places. If I find out you've continued this behavior with my father or anyone else, our next conversation will be in person. Understood? Yes, ma'am, Derek said quickly. I understand completely. Good, Sarah said, her voice finally warming slightly. Dad, are you okay? Do you need me to stay on the line? Frank looked around at the group of teenagers, who were now standing quietly and respectfully, their entire attitude transformed. I'm fine, sweetheart, Frank said, his voice filled with pride and love. Thank you for standing up for your old dad. Always, Dad, Sarah replied. I love you, and I can't wait to see you in 3 weeks. We'll have to celebrate my homecoming at Murphy's store. I want to meet Mrs. Murphy and thank her for looking out for you all these years. Derek's eyes widened at the mention of Mrs. Murphy, clearly realizing that Sarah had been gathering information about the local community even from thousands of miles away. I love you too, sweetheart, Frank said. Be safe out there. Will do, Dad. Derek, I hope our next conversation will be about all the good deeds you've been doing in the community. Yes, ma'am, Derek replied, his voice still shaky. The call ended, leaving Frank standing in the parking lot with 5 very subdued teenagers. The silence stretched for several moments as everyone processed what had just happened. Finally, Derek stepped forward, his body language completely different from before, humble, respectful, almost contrite. Mr. Morrison, he said quietly, I really am sorry. I had no right to treat you that way, regardless of your service record. I was being cruel for no reason, and that's not who I want to be. Frank studied Derek's face, looking for signs of insincerity, but saw only genuine remorse and embarrassment. The teenager had clearly been shaken by his encounter with Sarah's authority and was beginning to understand the gravity of his actions. We all make mistakes, Derek, Frank said gently. The important thing is what we do after we realize we've made them. Derek nodded earnestly. I want to do better. I want to do what your daughter suggested. Help people instead of hurting them. Could you maybe teach me about how to be respectful to elderly people? I realize I don't know anything about that. The request surprised Frank. He had expected Derek to simply slink away in embarrassment, not ask for guidance. But looking at the teenager's face, Frank could see genuine desire to change, to become better than he had been. I'd be happy to help you learn, Derek, Frank said with a small smile. But first, let me ask you something. Why were you treating me that way in the first place? What did I do to make you angry? Derek looked down at his feet, clearly struggling with the question. Honestly, you didn't do anything. I was just, I don't know, showing off for my friends, I guess. Making myself feel big by making you feel small. It was stupid and cruel, and I don't have any good excuse for it. Frank nodded appreciatively. The honesty was a good start. And your friends? Frank asked, looking at the other 4 teenagers who were still standing awkwardly nearby. What about you boys? Do you want to learn how to be better neighbors too? The red-haired boy, Tommy, stepped forward hesitantly. Mr. Morrison, I'm really sorry too. We were all just following Derek's lead, but that's not an excuse. We should have known better. The others murmured similar apologies, and Frank found himself looking at 5 genuinely remorseful young people instead of the pack of bullies they had been just minutes before. Well then, Frank said, his voice taking on a slightly lighter tone, I suppose we should start your education right away. The first lesson in respecting elderly people is understanding that we're not just old bodies taking up space. We're living libraries of experience, wisdom, and stories. Every elderly person you meet has lived through decades of history, overcome challenges you can't imagine, and learned lessons that took a lifetime to master. The teenagers listened intently, clearly taking his words seriously. The second lesson, Frank continued, is that kindness costs nothing but means everything. A simple smile, a held door, a patient ear. These things could transform an elderly person's entire day. Derek was nodding eagerly, clearly committed to changing his behavior. What else can we do, Mr. Morrison? What would actually help? Frank smiled, remembering his daughter's pride and strength, drawing energy from the knowledge that she would be home soon. Well, Derek, let me tell you about some of the challenges elderly people face, and then we can brainstorm ways you might help address them. As Frank began to explain the realities of aging, the isolation, the physical challenges, the feeling of being forgotten by a rapidly changing world, he realized that this confrontation, as unpleasant as it had been, might actually lead to something positive. These teenagers were getting a real education about respect, empathy, and community responsibility. And in 3 weeks, Sarah would be home to see the results of this lesson firsthand. Over the next 2 weeks, Frank's life transformed in ways he never could have imagined. What started as a humiliating confrontation with local bullies had evolved into something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of community and purpose that filled the lonely spaces in his daily routine. Derek had taken Sarah's challenge seriously, perhaps more seriously than anyone had expected. The very next day after their encounter, he showed up at Frank's front door at 8 in the morning, dressed in work clothes and carrying a notebook. "Mr. Morrison," Derek had said when Frank answered the door, clearly nervous but determined, "I know you said you'd help me learn how to be respectful to elderly people, but I realized I should start by being respectful to you. Is there anything I can do to help around your house?" Frank had been surprised by the earnestness in the teenager's voice. This wasn't the same cocky, cruel young man who had tormented him in the parking lot. Something fundamental had shifted in Derek's understanding of the world, and Frank could see it in his posture, his tone, and most importantly, his eyes. "Well, Derek," Frank had said after a moment of consideration, "my gutters have been clogged for months, and I can't safely get up on a ladder anymore. If you're serious about helping, that would be genuinely useful." Derek had spent the entire morning cleaning Frank's gutters, refusing any offer of payment and asking thoughtful questions about home maintenance, military service, and life in general. By lunchtime, Frank found himself actually enjoying the young man's company. "Mr. Morrison," Derek had said as they sat on Frank's porch drinking lemonade, "can I ask you about Vietnam? I mean, if it's not too personal or painful to talk about." Frank had studied Derek's face, looking for any sign of mockery or morbid curiosity, but found only genuine interest and respect. For the first time in years, he found himself wanting to share some of his experiences with someone from the younger generation. "It's not easy to talk about," Frank had admitted, "but it's important for people to understand what war really means, especially people your age who might face similar choices someday." Derek had listened intently as Frank shared carefully chosen stories about his service. Not the worst parts, but enough to convey the reality of combat, the bonds between soldiers, and the lasting impact of war on those who survive it. The teenager had asked thoughtful questions and shown genuine emotion when Frank talked about friends who hadn't made a home. "I never understood," Derek had said quietly when Frank finished. "I thought military service was just like a job or something. I didn't realize how much soldiers actually sacrifice." That conversation had been the beginning of an unexpected friendship. Derek started stopping by Frank's house every few days, initially to complete tasks like yard work or small repairs, but increasingly just to talk. He brought his friends along sometimes, and gradually all 5 teenagers became regular visitors to Frank's home. Tommy, the red-haired boy, turned out to have a genuine interest in history and spent hours listening to Frank's stories about how the neighborhood had changed over the decades. The other boys, Marcus, James, and Alex, each found their own ways to connect with Frank, whether through his knowledge of cars, his advice about dealing with difficult parents, or simply his willingness to listen to their problems without judgment. But the real transformation was in Derek himself. Frank watched as the angry, entitled teenager evolved into a thoughtful young man who seemed genuinely committed to becoming a better person. Derek started volunteering at the local senior center, reading to residents, and helping with activities. He organized his friends to shovel walkways for elderly neighbors after snowstorms. He even convinced his parents to sponsor a monthly dinner at the community center for seniors living alone. "You know what I realized?" Derek said to Frank one afternoon as they worked together in Frank's garden. "I was angry all the time before, but I didn't even know why. I had everything I wanted, but I still felt empty inside. Helping people, actually making a difference in someone's day. It makes me feel like I matter. Frank smiled as he watched Derek carefully transplant seedlings, marveling at how much the young man had changed. That's the secret that took me years to learn in the military, Frank told him. When you serve something bigger than yourself, when you focus on helping others instead of just getting ahead, that's when you find real satisfaction in life. During these 2 weeks, Frank also received daily calls from Sarah, who was eagerly monitoring the situation from overseas. She was amazed by the reports she was getting from Mrs. Murphy and other neighbors about Derek's transformation. "Dad," Mrs. Murphy says, "Derek and his friends have been helping elderly customers carry their groceries every day," Sarah reported during one of their calls. She says the whole atmosphere around the store has changed. People are actually looking forward to their shopping trips because they know they'll be treated with kindness. Frank felt a deep pride, not just in Derek's progress, but in his daughter's wisdom. Sarah's intervention had been perfectly calibrated, tough enough to shock Derek into recognizing the seriousness of his behavior, but also offering him a path to redemption that allowed him to maintain his dignity while learning important lessons. "Your daughter is remarkable," Derek had told Frank one day. "She could have just threatened me or got me in trouble with my parents or the police. Instead, she gave me a chance to become someone better. That takes real strength and wisdom." As Sarah's homecoming approached, Frank found himself more excited than he had been in years. Not only was his beloved daughter returning safely from deployment, but she would be coming home to a completely transformed situation. Instead of finding her father being bullied and isolated, she would discover that he had become a central figure in a group of young people who were learning about service, respect, and community responsibility. 3 days before Sarah's scheduled arrival, Derek approached Frank with an unusual request. "Mr. Morrison," Derek said, his voice carrying the nervous excitement of someone planning a surprise, "my friends and I have been talking, and we want to do something special for when your daughter gets home. Would you mind if we organized a welcome home celebration for her?" Frank was touched by the gesture, but also concerned about the implications. "Derek, that's very thoughtful, but Sarah is a very private person. She doesn't like a lot of attention or fanfare. That's exactly why we want to do this," Derek explained earnestly. "From everything you've told us about her, she spent her whole career serving other people and protecting others. We want to show her that there are people here at home who appreciate that service and who care about her family." Derek's plan was simple but heartfelt. He had coordinated with Mrs. Murphy to use the community room behind her store, and he and his friends had been secretly decorating it with patriotic banners and photographs. They had also reached out to other neighbors, particularly elderly residents who had heard about Frank's situation and Derek's transformation. "We're not planning anything big or overwhelming," Derek assured Frank. "Just a small gathering of people who want to say thank you to your daughter for her service and who want to celebrate the fact that she has such an amazing father." Frank felt his eyes misting over at Derek's words. The idea that this young man who had once tormented him was now planning to honor his daughter was almost overwhelming. "I think Sarah would be very moved by that gesture," Frank said finally. "But let's keep it small and understated. She'll appreciate the thought more than any grand display." On the day of Sarah's homecoming, Frank dressed in his best suit and pinned his military ribbons to his chest for the first time in years. Sarah had called from the airport, and Derek and his friends had stationed themselves around the neighborhood to watch for her arrival. Frank was sitting on his porch, his heart full of anticipation, when a black sedan pulled up in front of his house. Sarah emerged from the passenger side, and Frank's breath caught in his throat. His daughter looked strong and confident in her Navy uniform, her bearing reflecting all the training and experience she had gained during her deployment. But she wasn't alone. 3 other people emerged from the sedan, all wearing Navy uniforms with the distinctive SEAL insignia. Sarah had brought members of her team home with her. "Dad," Sarah called out, breaking into a run toward the porch. Frank stood as quickly as his aging legs would allow and embraced his daughter tightly, feeling the solid reality of her presence after months of worry and loneliness. "Welcome home, sweetheart," he whispered into her ear. "It's good to be home, Dad," she replied, holding him close. "I've missed you so much." After a long moment, Sarah pulled back and gestured toward her companions. "Dad, I want you to meet some of my teammates. This is Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, Petty Officer Blake, and Petty Officer Anderson." Guys, this is my father, Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison, United States Army, retired. The three SEALs stepped forward and shook Frank's hand with the respect that one warrior shows to another. Frank stood a little straighter, feeling the pride and camaraderie that he hadn't experienced in years. Sir, Chief Rodriguez said, your daughter talks about you constantly. It's an honor to meet the man who raised such an outstanding SEAL. Frank felt his chest swell with pride, but before he could respond, Derek appeared around the corner of the house, leading his four friends. The teenager had dressed in clean clothes and carried himself with a confidence and respect that Frank barely recognized from their first encounter. Lieutenant Morrison, Derek said, approaching Sarah with appropriate military bearing. I am Derek Chen. We spoke on the phone a few weeks ago. Sarah studied Derek for a moment, her professional instincts clearly evaluating the young man who had once harassed her father. Frank watched nervously, unsure how this meeting would go. Derek, Sarah said finally, her voice neutral but not unfriendly. I've been hearing very interesting reports about you from my father and the neighbors. Derek's face reddened slightly, but he maintained eye contact. Ma'am, I want you to know that I've thought every day about our phone conversation. You gave me a chance to become a better person, and I've tried very hard not to waste that opportunity. Sarah's expression softened slightly. And what have you learned, Derek? I've learned that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through your actions, Derek replied. I've learned that service to others is more fulfilling than serving only yourself. And I've learned that your father is one of the finest men I've ever had the privilege to know. Frank watched as Sarah's professional demeanor gave way to genuine warmth. She could see the sincerity in Derek's words and the fundamental change in his character. Those are important lessons, Sarah said with a slight smile. And I understand you've been putting them into practice. Yes, ma'am, Derek said proudly. Your father has taught me and my friend what it really means to be good neighbors and good citizens. We've been volunteering at the senior center, helping elderly residents with yard work and errands, and just trying to show respect to people who have earned it through their life experiences. Sarah looked at her father with obvious pride and affection. It sounds like you've been doing some important teaching, Dad. Frank smiled, feeling a contentment he hadn't experienced in years. Derek and his friends have been excellent students. They've reminded me that young people are capable of tremendous growth and positive change when they're given proper guidance and genuine opportunities to serve others. Chief Rodriguez, who had been listening to the conversation with interest, stepped forward. Derek, is it? I'm curious about this volunteer work you're doing. Tell me more about that. Derek straightened even more, clearly honored to be addressed by a Navy SEAL. Sir, we started by helping individual elderly neighbors with things like grocery shopping and yard work. But then we realized we could have a bigger impact by working with the senior center to organize regular activities and support programs. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. That shows strategic thinking. You identified a need and developed a systematic approach to address it. That's good leadership potential. Derek beamed at the praise, and Frank could see how much the recognition from a military professional meant to the young man. Actually, Derek said, his excitement growing, we've planned a small welcome home celebration for Lieutenant Morrison and her team. If you're willing to participate, the whole neighborhood would be honored to thank you for your service. Sarah looked surprised and touched. Derek, that's very thoughtful, but you didn't need to, ma'am. Derek interrupted respectfully. After everything you've done for our country and everything your father has done for our community, it's the least we can do. Besides, he added with a slight grin, we figured if we were going to throw a party, we should do it right. Frank chuckled, recognizing Derek's growing confidence and sense of humor. The transformation from bully to community leader had been remarkable to witness. Lead the way, Derek, Sarah said warmly. I'm honored that you would organize something like this. As they walked toward Murphy's store, Frank marveled at how completely his life had changed in just 3 weeks. He was no longer the lonely, harassed, elderly man who had been afraid to go grocery shopping. Instead, he found himself at the center of a vibrant community of friends spanning multiple generations, all connected by shared values of respect, service, and mutual support. Most importantly, his daughter was home safely, and she was able to see him not as a victim who needed protection, but as a respected member of his community who was making a positive difference in the lives of others. The celebration that Derek and his friends had organized was indeed small and understated, but It was filled with genuine warmth and appreciation. Mrs. Murphy had prepared refreshments, and about 30 neighbors had gathered to welcome Sarah home and thank her team for their service. Frank watched with deep satisfaction as Sarah moved through the crowd, graciously accepting thanks while also showing genuine interest in the stories and experiences of the people she met. She had inherited his ability to connect with people from all walks of life, and he could see how much her presence meant to the neighbors who had heard so much about her. But the moment that meant the most to Frank came when Derek approached Sarah near the end of the evening. "Lieutenant Morrison," Derek said quietly, "I want to thank you for giving me a second chance. You could have just had me arrested or gotten me in serious trouble. Instead, you challenged me to become better. That changed my life." Sarah smiled and placed a hand on Derek's shoulder. "Derek, I didn't change your life. I just pointed you in the right direction. You did all the hard work of actually changing. That took courage and character, and I'm proud of you for it." Derek's eyes filled with tears, and Frank felt his own emotions welling up as he watched this exchange. His daughter's wisdom and compassion had not only resolved a difficult situation, but had genuinely transformed a young person's life trajectory. As the evening wound down and the neighbors began to head home, Frank found himself surrounded by his extended family, his daughter and her teammates, Derek and his friends, Mrs. Murphy, and several elderly neighbors who had become regular parts of his social circle. "Dad," Sarah said as they prepared to leave, "I'm so proud of what you've accomplished here. You built something really special." Frank looked around at the faces surrounding him, young and old, military and civilian, all connected by shared respect and genuine care for one another. "We all build it together, sweetheart," he replied. "That's what community really means." As they walked home together under the evening stars, Frank realized that his greatest victory wasn't surviving war or raising a remarkable daughter or even transforming a group of bullies into community volunteers. His greatest victory was learning that it's never too late to build new relationships, teach important lessons, and create positive change in the world around you. And with Sarah home and Derek committed to continuing his volunteer work, Frank knew that the best chapters of this story were still to come. The weeks following Sarah's homecoming were unlike anything Frank had experienced since his wife's passing 3 years earlier. His house, once quiet and lonely, now buzzed with activity and conversation. Sarah had taken a temporary leave to spend time with him, and Derek and his friends had become such regular visitors that Frank had started keeping extra chairs around his kitchen table. What surprised Frank most was how naturally Sarah and Derek's group had bonded. Rather than viewing the teenagers as potential troublemakers, Sarah recognized them as young people with genuine potential who simply needed proper guidance and positive challenges. Within days of her return, she had become an informal mentor to all 5 boys, sharing lessons about leadership, discipline, and service that went far beyond what Frank could have taught them alone. "You know what I think these boys need?" Sarah said to her father one morning as they watched Derek and Tommy work together to repair a neighbor's fence. "They need a real project, something that will challenge them and show them what they're capable of achieving when they work as a team." Frank sipped his coffee and considered his daughter's words. Over the past month, he had watched Derek transform from bully to community volunteer, but he could see that the young man was hungry for something more substantial than random acts of kindness. Derek had natural leadership abilities and a growing sense of purpose that needed to be channeled into something meaningful. "What did you have in mind?" Frank asked. Sarah's eyes lit up with the same expression she had worn as a child when she was planning something ambitious. "I've been talking to Chief Rodriguez about community outreach programs. The military is always looking for ways to connect with local communities and demonstrate the values we represent. What if we created a youth leadership program that pairs these kids with veterans in the neighborhood?" The idea intrigued Frank. He knew there were several other veterans in their community, men and women who had served in different conflicts and different branches of the military. Many of them, like him, had been feeling disconnected from younger generations who didn't understand or appreciate their experiences. It would be good for everyone involved, Frank mused. The veterans would have a chance to share their knowledge and feel valued, and the kids would learn about service, sacrifice, and leadership from people who have actually lived those values. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. And Derek could be the test case. If we can develop a program that works with him and his friends, we could expand it to other communities. The military is always looking for successful models to replicate. That afternoon, Sarah pitched the idea to Derek when he stopped by to help Frank install new weather stripping around the windows. Derek listened intently as Sarah explained her vision for a formal mentorship program that would pair teenagers with local veterans for monthly projects focused on community service and leadership development. You're talking about something bigger than just volunteering at the senior center, Derek said, his voice reflecting both excitement and nervousness. You're talking about real responsibility. I'm talking about giving you and your friends the chance to become the leaders your community needs, Sarah replied. But it would require a serious commitment. This wouldn't be something you could quit when it got difficult or boring. Derek straightened his shoulders, and Frank could see the young man's growing confidence in his posture and expression. Lieutenant Morrison, after everything your father has taught me about service and sacrifice, I'm ready for that kind of challenge. My friends are too. Sarah smiled. I was hoping you'd say that, because Chief Rodriguez and I have already identified 3 other veterans in the neighborhood who might be interested in participating. We're talking about creating something that could genuinely impact this community for years to come. Over the next week, Sarah and Frank reached out to other veterans in their neighborhood. They were amazed by the enthusiastic response they received. It seemed that many older veterans have been feeling just as disconnected and purposeless as Frank had been before Derek's transformation. Robert Jenkins, a 7-year-old Marine veteran who had served in the Gulf War, jumped at the chance to work with young people again. I've been watching those kids helping around the neighborhood, he told Frank during their initial meeting. They remind me of some of the young Marines I trained back in the day. Lots of energy and potential, just needing the right direction. Maria Santos, a 65-year-old Army veteran who had served in logistics during the Cold War, was equally enthusiastic. I've been looking for ways to give back to the community since I retired, she said. Working with teenagers sounds both terrifying and exciting. The third veteran was perhaps the most surprising addition to their group. Walter Kim was 82 years old and had served in the Korean War. He had been even more reclusive than Frank, rarely leaving his house except for medical appointments. But when Sarah and Frank explained the program to him, something sparked in his eyes that hadn't been there in years. You know, Walter said slowly, I've been thinking lately that I've spent too many years keeping my stories to myself. Maybe it's time to share what I've learned with people who can actually benefit from it. The first official meeting of what Sarah had named the Community Leadership Corps took place in the community room at Murphy's store on a crisp Saturday morning in November. Frank looked around at the assembled group, 5 teenagers and for veterans spanning nearly 70 years of American history, and felt a deep sense of anticipation. Sarah stood at the front of the room, her military bearing commanding immediate respect from everyone present. Before we talk about projects and goals, she began, I want everyone to understand what we're trying to accomplish here. This isn't just about keeping teenagers busy or giving veterans something to do. This is about building bridges between generations and creating a model for community engagement that could be replicated anywhere in the country. Derek raised his hand, his demeanor serious and respectful. Ma'am, what kind of projects are we talking about? I mean, we've been doing volunteer work, but this sounds like something more structured. Good question, Sarah replied. Chief Rodriguez and I have been researching community needs, and we've identified several areas where a dedicated group could make a real impact. For example, there's been a significant increase in elderly residents who are struggling with isolation and basic maintenance tasks. There are also environmental issues in the local park that need addressing, and the community center needs renovations that are beyond their current budget. Walter Kim spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had managed complex logistical operations during wartime. Those are all worthy projects, but there are also complex undertakings that require planning, coordination, and sustained effort. Are these young people ready for that level of responsibility? Frank watched Derek's face as Walter posed a challenge. Instead of defensiveness or uncertainty, Frank saw determination and excitement. Sir, Derek said, addressing Walter with genuine respect. I can only speak for myself and my friends, but we've learned over the past month that real satisfaction comes from taking on real responsibilities. We're tired of being treated like kids who can't handle anything serious. We want to prove that we can make a meaningful contribution. Tommy nodded vigorously. Mr. Morrison has taught us that service isn't just about feeling good about yourself. It's about actually solving problems and making life better for other people. Maria Santos Mila da Provingli. That's exactly the attitude we need. But, Derek, you and your friends need to understand that once we commit to a project, we see it through to completion, no matter how long it takes or how difficult it becomes. Are you prepared for that? The five teenagers looked at each other, and Frank could see them silently communicating their commitment to the group. Finally, Derek spoke for all of them. Yes, ma'am. We're ready. Sarah nodded with satisfaction. Then, let's talk about our first project. Chief Rodriguez has been working with the Parks Department, and they've identified a serious problem with erosion and water damage in Riverside Park. The city doesn't have the budget to address it properly, but they've agreed to provide materials if we can provide the labor and project management. Robert Jenkins leaned forward with interest. What kind of timeline are we looking at? The work needs to be completed before spring runoff begins, which gives us about 4 months, Sarah explained. It will require significant earth moving, installation of drainage systems, replanting of vegetation, and construction of retaining walls. It's not a small project. Frank felt a surge of excitement as he listened to the scope of the undertaking. This wasn't busy work or token community service. This was a genuine infrastructure project that would require the kind of teamwork, planning, and dedication that military operations demanded. What about supervision and expertise? Walter asked. I assume we're not expected to figure out drainage engineering on our own. The Parks Department will provide technical guidance, Sarah replied, and Chief Rodriguez has connections with several construction professionals who have volunteered to provide consultation. But the day-to-day project management and most of the labor will be our responsibility. Derek was practically vibrating with excitement. This is exactly what we've been hoping for. A chance to do something that really matters, something that will still be making a difference years from now. Marcus, who had been quiet until now, raised his hand tentatively. I have to ask, what if we mess up? What if we're not good enough or smart enough to handle something this big? Frank was proud to see Sarah's response. Instead of dismissing the concern or offering empty reassurance, she addressed it directly and honestly. Marcus, failure is always a possibility when you take on something challenging, she said. But failure is also how we learn and grow. The difference between success and failure isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to work hard, learn from mistakes, and support each other through difficult times. Walter, kim nodet approvingly. That's military wisdom right there. Every successful operation I ever ran involved setbacks, unexpected challenges, and moments when we weren't sure we could accomplish our mission. But we succeeded because we refused to give up, and we worked together as a team. Maria Santos added, plus, you won't be working alone. Each of you will be paired with a veteran mentor who will help you develop your leadership skills and learn how to manage complex projects. This is as much about education as it is about accomplishing the work. Frank watched as the conversation continued, seeing the excitement and commitment building in both the teenagers and the veterans. This was more than just a community service project. It was the foundation of something that could transform how young people and older adults interacted in their community. So, Sarah said, looking around the room, are we ready to commit to this project? Are we ready to show this community what the Leadership Corps can accomplish? The response was immediate and unanimous, a chorus of enthusiastic agreement from both generations represented in the room. Then, let's start planning, Sarah said with a grin that reminded Frank of the determined little girl who had once decided to build a treehouse in their backyard and had refused to stop until it was complete. Over the next 2 hours, the group dove into the details of project planning. They discussed work schedules, material procurement, safety protocols, and communication systems. Frank was amazed by how naturally the teenagers and veterans worked together, with each generation bringing different strengths and perspectives to the planning process. Derek emerged as a natural coordinator, able to bridge the gap between the structured military approach favored by the veterans and the enthusiastic creativity of his peer group. Tommy showed an unexpected aptitude for technical details, asking insightful questions about drainage calculations and soil composition. Marcus, despite his initial concerns, demonstrated strong organizational skills as he worked with Maria to develop supply lists and timeline charts. By the end of the meeting, they had established teams, assigned initial responsibilities, and scheduled their first site visit for the following weekend. Frank felt a deep satisfaction as he watched the group exchange contact information and make plans for additional meetings throughout the week. "Dad," Sarah said as they walked home together, "I think we might have created something really special here." Frank nodded, thinking about the enthusiasm and commitment he had seen in both the young people and the veterans. "I think you're right, sweetheart. These kids have found something worth committing to, and the veterans have found a way to share their knowledge and experience with people who genuinely appreciate it. But the real test will be when things get difficult," Sarah observed. "When the weather turns bad, when the work gets harder than expected, when conflicts arise within the group. That's when we'll find out whether this program actually works." Frank smiled, thinking about Derek's transformation from bully to leader, about Walter Kim's emergence from isolation, about the genuine respect and camaraderie he had seen developing between people who had previously lived in completely separate worlds. "I have a feeling," Frank said confidently, "that these people are going to surprise us with what they're capable of accomplishing together." As they reached their house, Frank looked back toward Murphy's store where several members of the leadership corps were still gathered in the parking lot, animatedly discussing plans for the park project. The sight of teenagers and elderly veterans working together as equals, united by shared purpose and mutual respect, filled him with a hope he hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began the real work of turning their ambitious plans into reality. But tonight, Frank was content to know that his daughter was home safely, that his community had been strengthened by unexpected friendships, and that a group of young people had discovered the satisfaction that comes from serving something greater than themselves. The transformation that had begun with a confrontation in a parking lot was now becoming something that could impact their entire community for generations to come. And Frank Morrison, the lonely elderly man who had once been afraid to go grocery shopping, was now at the center of it all. 6 months later, Frank stood at the edge of Riverside Park on a warm spring morning, watching dozens of community members explore the transformed landscape that had become the crown jewel of their neighborhood. Where once there had been eroded hillsides, muddy pathways, and dying vegetation, there now stood a beautifully designed series of terrace gardens, stone retaining walls, and winding walkways that followed the natural contours of the land. The Community Leadership Corps had not only completed their ambitious project on schedule, but they had exceeded everyone's expectations in both the scope and quality of their work. What had started as a simple erosion control project had evolved into a comprehensive park renovation that included accessible walking paths, native plant gardens, a memorial area honoring local veterans, and even a small amphitheater for community events. "Dad, you should be incredibly proud," Sarah said, joining him at his observation post. She was scheduled to return to active duty in 2 weeks, but the program she had helped create was now self-sustaining and had already been replicated in 3 neighboring communities. Frank watched Derek directing a group of younger children in planting wildflowers along one of the new pathways. The teenager who had once bullied elderly people for entertainment was now mentoring kids half his age, teaching them about environmental stewardship and community responsibility. The transformation was so complete that Frank sometimes had to remind himself that this was the same young man who had once knocked his cane from his hand and mocked his military service. "I'm proud of all of them," Frank replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm especially proud of you for seeing the potential in those kids when everyone else, including me, had written them off." The past 6 months had been challenging in ways none of them had anticipated. The park project had tested every member of the leadership corps physically, mentally, and emotionally. There had been setbacks, conflicts, and moments when it seemed like the undertaking was too ambitious for their group to handle. The first major crisis had come in December when an early winter storm damaged much of their initial work and forced them to completely redesign their drainage system. Derek had wanted to quit, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the repairs needed, but Walter Kim had taken the young man aside for what Frank later learned was a tough conversation about persistence and character. "Son," Walter had told Derek, "in Korea, we had to rebuild the same bridge 3 times because the enemy kept destroying it. Each time, it would have been easier to find a different route or give up entirely. But that bridge was critical to our mission, so we kept rebuilding it until we got it right. That's what separates leaders from quitters, the willingness to face setbacks and keep moving forward." Derek had not only returned to work the next day with renewed determination, but he had rallied his friends and convinced them to put in extra hours over their winter break to get the project back on schedule. Frank had watched with amazement as the teenager demonstrated leadership skills that many adults never develop. The second major test had come when Marcus's father lost his job, and the family began struggling financially. Marcus had wanted to drop out of the leadership corps to take a part-time job and help with family expenses. Instead of accepting his resignation, the group had rallied around him in a way that demonstrated the depth of the bonds they had formed. Robert Jenkins had used his connections to help Marcus's father find a new position, while Maria Santos had arranged for Marcus to receive a small stipend for his work on the park project through a veterans organization grant. Walter Kim had even offered to provide tutoring to help Marcus keep his grades up while balancing his increased responsibilities. "We don't abandon our teammates," Derek had told Marcus during a group meeting. "That's not who we are anymore." The comment had struck Frank deeply because it reflected not just Derek's personal growth, but the emergence of a genuine team culture within the leadership corps. These young people had learned that they were stronger together than they were individually, and they had committed to supporting each other through both successes and challenges. The most profound transformation, however, had been in Walter Kim. The elderly Korean War veteran had emerged from decades of self-imposed isolation to become one of the most effective mentors in the program. His engineering background proved invaluable for the technical aspects of the park project, but more importantly, his quiet wisdom and patient teaching style had made him especially effective at working with teenagers who were struggling with confidence or motivation. "Mr. Kim saved my life," Alex had confided to Frank during one of their regular check-ins. "I was ready to drop out of school because I thought I was too stupid to succeed at anything. But he showed me that intelligence isn't about being naturally smart. It's about being willing to work hard and learn from people who know more than you do." Walter's influence had extended far beyond the park project. He had started offering free tutoring sessions in his home for any student in the neighborhood who needed help with math or science. And his patient teaching had helped several struggling students dramatically improve their academic performance. "I wish I had started sharing what I know years ago," Walter had told Frank. "These kids have given me a sense of purpose I haven't felt since I left the military." The success of the leadership corps had attracted attention from local government officials, military leaders, and community organizations throughout the state. Sarah had been invited to present their model at several conferences, and requests for consultation and program development were pouring in from communities that wanted to replicate their success. But Frank knew that the real measure of their accomplishment wasn't the recognition they were receiving or the impressive physical improvements they had made to the park. The real success was visible in the faces of the people around him. Teenagers who had discovered their capacity for leadership and service, veterans who had found new purpose and community, and neighbors who had learned that age differences could be bridges rather than barriers when people shared common values and goals. "Mr. Morrison," a voice called out from behind him. Frank turned to see Derek approaching with a woman in her 40s who looked familiar, but whom he couldn't immediately place. "Mr. Morrison," Derek continued as they reached him, "I'd like you to meet my mother, Dr. Lisa Chun." "Mom, this is the man I've been telling you about, the veteran who changed my life." Dr. Chin extended her hand with a warm smile that reminded Frank of Derek's new demeanor. "Mr. Morrison, I can't thank you enough for what you've done for my son. The Derek who comes home from your meetings is completely different from the angry, directionless teenager he was 6 months ago." Frank shook her hand, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the gratitude in her voice. "Dr. Chun, I think you're giving me too much credit. Derek did all the hard work of changing himself. I just provided some guidance along the way." "Don't be so modest, Dad," Sarah interjected with a grin. "You've become something of a legend in youth development circles. Dr. Rodriguez told me that Military Family Services is studying our program as a model for helping military children adjust to civilian communities." Derek's mother nodded enthusiastically. "Actually, that's why I wanted to meet you, Mr. Morrison. I'm a pediatric psychiatrist, and I've been working with military families for years. What you've accomplished with these teenagers is exactly the kind of positive intervention that so many young people need." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of applause from the new amphitheater, where the day's dedication ceremony was about to begin. Frank made his way to the seating area, amazed by the turnout. It seemed like the entire neighborhood had come to celebrate the completion of the park project and recognize the work of the leadership corps. Mayor Patricia Williams took the microphone first, praising the project as an example of what communities could accomplish when different generations work together toward common goals. She announced that the city was implementing a formal partnership with the Leadership Corps to address other community needs, and that similar programs were being developed in partnership with the National Guard and local veterans organizations. But the moment that meant the most to Frank came when Derek was invited to speak on behalf of the Leadership Corps. The young man walked to the microphone with confidence and poise that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. 6 months ago, Derek began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. I was the kind of person who thought strength meant making other people feel weak. I thought respect was something you could demand or take by force. I thought